I first heard the esteemed American author and academic Sarah Churchwell's powerful and passionate voice as a special guest on my very favorite podcast series, Talking Politics. Ever since that voice, in her many formidable media appearances on the BBC, for example, as well as on the page in her exquisite journalism and her magisterial books, has been essential in understanding America, that of today and that of yesterday, and how both of those are inextricably linked. To understand that is to understand the foundations of that precious building of American democracy, a building with windows opening our view to democratic vistas. For now, at least, may these views be sunny, partly clouded, or quickly darkening, you decide. Sarah Churchwell, to say a few words about her, is Professor of American Literature and Chair of Public Understanding of the Humanities at the School of Advanced Studies at the University of London. She writes regularly for The Guardian, for The New Statesman, The Financial Times, The New York Review of Books, and many other publications. She is Festival Director of the Being Human Festival, which will open in November, 250 events in the UK. She is also astonishingly relevant still with her older books. 2005's The Many Lives of Marilyn Monroe has just been talked about again when Netflix brought out the film Blonde. Relevant as well is still Behold America, A History of America First and the American Dream, also available at the book table with my dear colleagues, which Churchwell presented in our online event series, Transatlantic Tuesdays, at the height of the pandemic. And the latest one, you see it here because I got the last copy we still had. You can still order it at Jos Fritz, only takes a day, at the moment at least. And that connects the dots between the toxic legacy of the Confederacy, a classic Hollywood film, as you will see, and no less, the events of January the 6th, 2021. It is a true delight to have you here, Sarah Churchwell.
Well, thank you very much, Renee, for that incredibly generous introduction, and thank you all for being here, and thanks to you all as well for the invitation to come. It's my first trip to Freiburg, and I've only been here a couple of hours, so I haven't seen anything yet. But this is my first view of Freiburg, and it's lovely, and I'm looking forward to seeing it. But thanks very much for inviting me to come talk about this project. Renee mentioned that my previous book, Behold America, and in some ways this book is, if not a follow-up, it's a kind of sibling to that book. Behold America is a history of two phrases. The way I describe that book is saying that there's a kind of protagonist and an antagonist, and the protagonist is the phrase, the American dream, and I trace its evolution through cultural discourse, and then the phrase America First. And America First was a much more popular political phrase in the United States in the 1920s than really anybody had recalled or understood. And when Trump brought it back into the political conversation in America, the conversation around that was solely focused on its history in the debates around America's entry into the Second World War. But there was a long prehistory of America First. It actually goes back to the original nativist debates in the 1850s when the phrase first emerged. So I was tracing all of that, but Behold America really focuses on the 1920s and 1930s, and looking at that moment as a kind of capsule moment of some of the histories that we were seeing emerge during Trump's administration. And this Gone with the Wind book, The Wrath to Come, really goes just further back in time to still focused on the 20s and 30s, which is my area of expertise. But going back further and actually looking at the rewriting of the American Civil War and its aftermath, the period that we call Reconstruction, and the way that led up to the 1920s and 1930s, and then to today. So it's really looking at three moments at once. It's trying to look at the time in which the story Gone with the Wind takes place, which is it begins at the beginning of the American Civil War, so in 1861, and then it goes until 1873, which is basically the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of what was called redemption, and that was the restoration of white supremacy in the South. So that's the time period that Gone with the Wind, the story, covers. I meant to say, how many of you have seen the film Gone with the Wind? Okay, most of you. How many of you read the book? A few have read the book. Okay, is there anybody who's never seen or read and at all? No, that's fine. There's no shame in that. It's okay. That's perfectly acceptable. Some haven't. Is there anybody who's never heard of Gone with the Wind? Yeah, so everybody's heard of it, right? And so and there's a reason for that. It was one of the most phenomenally popular stories of the 20th century. It continues to be phenomenally popular, which is important to understand. It still sells about 300,000 copies a year, which, is a number that any living author would give their teeth for. And the film is still, when adjusted for inflation, the most popular film of all time, the most commercially successful film of all time. The quotes from the movie are still part of popular culture, even if people maybe don't know where they come from. Frankly, My Dear, I Don't Give a Damn is still the most famous movie quotation on the American Film Institute's list of famous film quotes. And in fact, I might come back to that quotation in a minute. So there are lots of ways in which it is a cultural event that is still with us. Its influence continues, whether you've seen it or not, it doesn't matter. And I should say, I wrote this book very much assuming a reader who'd heard of Gone with the Wind but had not necessarily read it or seen it. So that's not necessary to understand what I'm trying to do here. And I don't necessarily recommend going back and reading the book, although it has some saving graces. But so that's not really what this is about. But it's about trying to understand where America is today and trying to think through the history of America's divisions. So it begins with the insurrection, and it begins really with a question that I get asked all the time. I live in London. As you can hear, I'm American myself. And as Renee said, I comment on American culture and literature and history for the British media. And I get asked all the time. I mean, it's like the question that people ask me all the time is just, what is happening to America? Like, just what is happening? And they've been asking that ever since Trump got elected. And they asked that all the way up through the insurrection, and then they're asking it through the January 6 hearings and just saying, what on earth is happening? And that's really how I begin the book. I mean, that's literally how I begin the book, is what the hell happened to America? As we watch the insurrection, and I am calling it an insurrection. It was an insurrection. If anybody's been watching the January 6th hearings, you know that an enormous amount of evidence has been put forward to demonstrate that it was indeed an insurrection and not a spontaneous riot, and that it was an insurrection that Donald Trump was determined to ride at the head of. He wanted to ride his personal militia to the Capitol like Mussolini. And I make that analogy very, very carefully. I am not making that analogy loosely. And so it was an attempted, certainly fascistic, overtaking of the government. And I think that for people who study American history in detail and at length, there were many ways in which the insurrection was certainly not predictable, but was comprehensible. And as I was talking to people about it, I realized that a lot of that history is just not very well known. A lot of it is published, but you have to be reading academic specialist journals in American history to understand this. You have to have done a PhD in American history effectively to understand this. It's not part of our popular story. And so the question was, how do we tell a story about 160 years of American history, about these key moments, what's happening now, what I believe are the origins of what's happening now in the 20s and 30s, and then its deep roots in the Civil War and its aftermath, and arguably further back, but at least I would say we have to at least understand that history of the Civil War and its aftermath. And as part of this cultural debate as it was exploding, and we were watching, as Black Lives Matter was gaining momentum in 2020, and the protests over George Floyd's murder, And it was interesting to note that Gone with the Wind kept coming up. It was a touch point. People kept referring to it. You might remember that when Parasite became the first South Korean film to win a Best Oscar, a Best Picture Oscar, that Trump, at one of his rallies, wanted to know why we couldn't bring back movies like Gone with the Wind, right? It keeps coming up. People keep bringing it up. And then after the insurrection, it came up a lot. It came up as a shorthand for the history that was kind of symbolically unfolding in front of us as we watched the insurrection. And in particular, the extremely famous image, it became one of the iconic images of the insurrection, and I reproduce it in the book. There were basically two iconic images from the insurrection. One is the shaman guy with the horns and the fur and that guy, who's about to do hard time, so there's that. And the story's not without hope. But the other image is of the man, he was actually from Maryland, strolling past the Senate chambers with the Confederate flag, walking through the halls of the U.S. Capitol. And as I say in the book, to anybody who understands the actual history of that flag, and who understands, in fact, that the picture was taken in front of, we were trying to do PowerPoint, I didn't get to it, but you can all look at it on your phone if you want to. It's a really easy image to find. And he's actually walking, the photograph was taken in front of two portraits that are hanging in the Senate chamber of two Civil War figures, one from the North and one from the South, Charles Sumner and John C. Calhoun. And they were on opposite sides of the war. John C. Calhoun defended slavery. He died before the Civil War began, but he created some of its justifications. And he said that slavery, race-based slavery, what they called African slavery, and this is important because slavery was always raced when they talked about it. It was African slavery, specifically the enslavement of black people. And he said that it was a positive moral good, and created one of the justifications for the South's secession. And then Charles Sumner, who was a radical abolitionist, who was nearly beaten to death on the floor of the Senate chamber for his position of abolition. And then a man walked past with a Confederate flag, right? The Civil War was fought to defeat that flag. It was fought to make sure that that flag never flew in the U.S. Capitol. And we won the war. I'm from the North, so I'm allowed to say that. But I talk about that in the book, I should say. I think it's really important that part of the story I'm telling here is about the way that the white North, in the aftermath of the Civil War, basically convinced itself that the job was done, it had nothing further to do, and that we could preen ourselves on our own virtue and say we were the good guys, we had the moral high ground, and then get busy forgetting it and not actually see through the project of multiracial democracy that the Civil War was meant to begin. And that's really the story of Gone with the Wind, and it's really the story that I'm talking about here, is the story of the long struggle to create a truly multiracial democracy in the United States. And it seemed to me in trying to tell that story in some way that would be comprehensible, manageable, that wouldn't be a 20-year project for me to write, and, a 10,000-word book to ask you all, 10 million-word book. It is more than 10,000 words. It's 120,000 words, if you want to know. It was supposed to be 40. It ended up being 120, because it's a big story. And it seemed to me that Gone with the Wind was the right story the right way to frame this story for a couple of important reasons. One, as I say, is that it kept coming up. As a shorthand for understanding this whole complex history of the Civil War and its aftermath. But the second is because it's about myth-making. And what I really wanted to do was to think about the role that fiction and myth-making have in rewriting history, and the ways in which the lies, and that's why the subtitle of the book is Gone with the Wind and the Lies America Tells, because the project of myth-making is central to the ways in which these divisions in America have never been healed, the reasons why we've never reconciled as a country. And I say in the book, and I truly believe this, that a country that calls itself the United States is protesting too much. We have never been united. We have not been a united country. We have not created a united project. And we're still, some are trying, some are trying, to stoke the divisions. But we are pretty good at telling the history of our unity and insisting on unity, right? What did the leaders say as soon as the insurrection happened? We have to move on. We have to come together. They insisted on unity, right? But unity at the expense of justice. And we're watching that right now, right? Donald Trump just got subpoenaed by the January 6th committee 2 days ago, and he may not comply with it. And the questions about whether he will have to comply with it, about whether he will be above the law, about whether justice will be done, or whether unity, the name of unity, will be invoked in order to, once again, to say that the appearance of unity is more important than the reality of justice. And that's the trade that America, in my view anyway, keeps making. And it's the myth-making that enables us to do that. So Gone with the Wind symbolizes this whole mythical view of American history. Most of you have seen it or read it, and so you'll know what I'm referring to when I say this, but basically it's a romanticized, sentimental, nostalgic view of the race-based slavery in the Deep South as an idyllic world. And that's how Gone with the Wind famously opens, with a crawl that says it was a beautiful world of master and slave that is now gone with the wind, right? It was a land of knights and cavaliers and ladies fair. So it's this active project of mythologizing the past to say that that slavery in the Deep South was this beautiful world. And that idea, which became known as the Lost Cause, was an active propaganda campaign that was created through disinformation. It was conscious and deliberate by the White South in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War to rewrite the history of their participation in the war. And the consequences of that have been profound, and we're still really living with them. The thing to understand about the Civil War, which I think, at least in my experience, is not something, again, that's kind of popularly necessarily understood, is that we think of the Civil War as having been fought between North and South, which is true, but it was fought over the West. It was fought over the question of westward expansion and whether the new states that came into the Union would be slave states or free states, right? And when the Confederate states seceded, they seceded because the North, because Lincoln's administration was making it clear that they might someday outlaw slavery, someday. And they seceded on the basis that they wanted to embed slavery in their society. They said they said over and over again it was about slavery. Georgia, most of what I focus on here is Georgia because that's where Gone with the Wind takes place, of course. And in its articles of secession, Georgia stipulates slavery as its reason for seceding, something like 35 or 40 times. I can't remember off the top of my head. It's in the book. But it says it's about slavery over and over and over again. The speeches made clear it was about slavery. The debates made clear it was about slavery. They said, this is about slavery. They wrote a constitution for the Confederate States of America in which they said that it was forbidden to ever outlaw slavery in the Confederate States of America. So it was going to keep African slavery again, so race-based slavery in perpetuity in the Confederate States of America, and that it was mandated that it spread. So it was a project of territorial expansion. It was a colonizing project to move slavery west. And of course, there was a simple reason for that. They needed more land so that they could grow their plantations, and it's an economy. And so, but there's an expansionist project here that's really important for us to understand. And slavery was embedded in it. That was the whole point. And then as soon as they lost the war, they said slavery had nothing to do with it. Slavery? What slavery? We weren't fighting for slavery. This was absolutely not what we were fighting for. And what they began to say was that they were fighting over states' rights versus federal rights. They said that it was about individualism and their right to have their own way of life, and that the North was an aggressor, and that it was kind of occupying, or by the end of the war, it was an occupying force, that it was an incursion into their rights to have their own way of life, and that slavery was just incidental. That was just really a kind of pretext, that what they were really fighting over was their way of life and their right to self-determine, that it was about autonomy. And then what they started doing, which really takes chutzpah, but they had plenty of that, was invoking the revolutionary spirit of the United States founding. So they said this is actually about fighting back against a tyrannical overlord, i.e. Lincoln's government, and maintaining our right to self-determine. And that became the story that they told themselves, that they told the world, that they told the country, and eventually convinced everybody. I mean, convinced an awful lot of people anyway. And that story in shorthand became known as the lost cause. Right, this romantic notion that the South had been a noble way of life and that it had gone to war for noble reasons to defend this noble way of life, and that they knew they weren't going to win, but they were fighting on principle. Right? It's absolute nonsense, and the historical documentation makes very clear how nonsensical that position is, and so it's a fiction, right? But it was a fiction that then got absorbed into American history, into its historiography, and was taught as official history for the next century. It was absorbed into a worldview of the United States for many reasons, and I go into them in the book to try to explain, how this could have happened. But one of them is that one of the things that was appealing about that story, even to the North, was that it rewrote slavery as incidental, as something that we didn't have to think about, as something that we could marginalize, and it rewrote it as innocent. It said it was really kind of fine. And part of the story that they told and that Gone with the Wind tells is of a world in which African Americans prefer to be enslaved. And that's one of the things that happens in Gone with the Wind, is that at the end of the war, Scarlett's formerly enslaved workers, who the story insists love the O'Haras and want to stay with the O'Haras, they choose to remain with them out of loyalty. And the novel actually trashes black people who assert their rights. They call them free-issue darkies and free-issue the N-word. And that means people who are emancipated black people who are exercising their own freedoms. And they're the bad black people as far as the novel is concerned. So what I try to do in the book really is to it's a kind of it's a large project in fact versus fiction, basically, and looking at what happens when history goes into a story and myth comes out, and then how the myth-making then shapes the political aftermath of the United States. I'm just going to say one more thing, and then I'll open it up to questions, because it is, as I said just before we started, it is 160 years of American history that the book is going through. It's a 1,000-page novel. It's a 4-hour film. It's not something that can necessarily be summed up very easily. But I want to talk about one other aspect of it, and this one I'm going to actually, because I want to be specific here, I'm going to just pull up a little some notes here, because, and I was, as I say, delighted when Renee invited me to come speak to you, in part because I have had, since I've been working on Behold America, so in the last 5 years, I've had the pleasure of speaking at a few events around Germany. I've done a couple in Berlin and a couple in Munich, as I say, my first trip to Freiburg now, but talking about American fascism here. And I do want to talk about how the history of American fascism relates to this story. And then that may sound like I've just gone out of left field, and how did American fascism come into this? But I said that I think it's important that that we remember that one of the moments in this story is the 1920s and 1930s. Gone with the Wind came out in 1936. That's when the novel came out. That's when it became a runaway bestseller all over the world. Everybody loved it. The film rights were immediately snapped up. David Selznick was going to instantly turn it into a film. It became a big pop culture phenomenon. The search for Scarlett and Vivian, it's a famous story about looking for Vivian Leigh and looking for Scarlett and finding Vivian Leigh. And then the film was completed at the end of 1939, actually at the end of August 1939. They finished their final reshoots. And literally it wrapped as the Second World War was declared. And it began to circulate across the United States to be shown during the Phony War, and then it started to make its way across to Europe, right? Now, when Gone with the Wind is written about in American culture, in American studies, and in American cultural history, when it's positioned within that history of the 1930s, and when it's thought about as a story of the 1930s and not of the Civil War, right? It's about the Civil War, but it comes out in the 30s. It's always been framed as a story about the Depression. So it is a story in which it's a story about Scarlett O'Hara's survivalism. It's a story about her resilience and her defiance. These are the more positive aspects of the story. This is why people do still love it and identify with it and relate to it. Scarlett's a very interesting character. She's very, very problematic, but very interesting. She's also the first female everyman character in American culture. She's the first one who kind of everybody identified with, and the fact that she was a woman was part of the story, but didn't actually stop her from being seen as a universal character that everybody could identify with. She's not properly feminist, but she had, not least because she keeps wishing the woman who is her sexual rival would die. So I'm not going to allow that as, it's not good feminism. And who's actually a friend of hers, and so she's, Scarlett's an anti-heroine, right? She's a classic anti-heroine. And Mitchell intended her to be one. She wrote about that very explicitly. And I think that makes her very interesting as somebody who studies literature and culture. I like that she's an anti-heroine. She's a limited and problematic character, but she's a survivor. And she's defiant and she's resilient, and she absolutely is not going to let anything keep her down. And there's a famous scene, for the handful of you who haven't seen it, it's actually the end of the first act. There's an intermission, and Atlanta is burning, and she's gone home to her plantation, Tara, and she's determined to survive, and she's starving and she's retching because she's so hungry and she can't find any decent food. And she raises her fist to the sky and she says, "As God is my witness, I'll never be hungry again. No, nor any of my folks. If I have to lie, cheat, steal, or kill, as God is my witness, I'll never be hungry again." You can see how many times I've seen this movie. I loved this movie as a kid. I should always say that. I should preface that because it's actually important to understand that this, for me, is also a revisionist project. That it was a film that it's in my head. And one that I realized I really needed to rethink. And that's part of what was driving this, but we'll maybe come to that in questions if people are interested. But so it has been understood as a story of the Depression where audiences responded to that defiance of hunger, and to Scarlett framed on a burnt-out farm that looks drought-stricken. And so during the Dust Bowl, during the droughts of the mid-1930s, that American audiences were responding to her determination to keep her home when homelessness was skyrocketing during the Great Depression. 25% of Americans in the worst part of the Depression were jobless, and as I say, homelessness was spiking. So people were clearly, it was resonating with audiences. But the backdrop of the 30s that we have dropped out of our conversation about Gone with the Wind is the rise of European fascism, and the fact that when it appeared in 1936, it was the year that the Axis was declared. It was the year that the Spanish Civil War began. It was the year that Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. And these were, this conversation, there was a live debate about American fascism at this time, and Gone with the Wind entered into it. And so it was always understood at the time as being a story that related to the question of what was happening abroad and what was happening in the United States. Because one of the reasons why I have said that this book is about the lies America tells is that it's not just lies about the Civil War and its aftermath and then the creation of the lost cause as an original big lie, and that's a very big lie, that, as I say, has had vast consequences for American history, but also for our politics. But there are also other big lies that we have told, and one of them is the suppression of our own history of American fascism. We have written a version of American history that basically says there was no fascism in the United States, and that is simply not true. It's demonstrably not true. There were fascist movements. They didn't take power, but they were seeking power. They were often white Christian nationalists, not exclusively, but generally they tended to be. They often moved in and out of the Ku Klux Klan. There's a whole history of the Klan that is a really important part of this story that I go into in great detail. Both the first Klan which emerged in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War in 1866, and then the so-called Second Klan, which was in the 1920s. And as the 1920s, and that's the Klan with the pointy caps and the white hoods that everybody thinks about as the kind of iconic, ideas of the Klan. And that was based in Atlanta, where Gone with the Wind takes place, where Margaret Mitchell lived her whole life. She had the Klan all around her. People don't always remember this, especially if they've only seen the film, but Ashley Wilkes, who Scarlett loves for all of the story until the final second when she realizes Rhett Butler is the one she really loves, Ashley Wilkes is the head of the Atlanta Klan. That is, in the novel, it's explicit, and in the film, it gets euphemized that he's the head of a social club. But that's the social club. It was a social club called the Ku Klux Klan. And the novel is very explicit about this. Frank Kennedy, Scarlett's second husband, is also a member of the Klan. That's how he dies. He dies on a Klan raid. Rhett is not a member of the Klan. And so sometimes when I do these talks, people are like, oh, but Rhett wasn't a member of the Klan. So he's the hero. We can redeem Rhett. Afraid not. So the reason Rhett isn't a member of the Klan is because he's not a joiner. Like, he doesn't like clubs. He's a renegade. So that's part of his sexy scoundrel, heroic quality. And so he's too cool to join the Klan, right? But along with the fist raising, right, one of the most famous scenes in Gone with the Wind is when Scarlett makes a dress out of her mother's green velvet curtains so that she can go visit Rhett in jail. If you haven't seen it, there is a spoof of it by the comedian Carol Burnett from the 70s that is available on YouTube, which is one of the funniest things ever filmed. You have to see the original first to get how funny it is. And Carol Burnett forgets to take off the curtain rods, and so she comes out with the full curtains on, so it's actually hilarious. That's an aside, but I always think we need some comic relief in this story because it's a very dark story. And Scarlett goes to visit Rhett in jail wearing this fabulous velvet dress. And in my experience, most people misremember that scene. They think that Rhett is in jail because he's a prisoner of war of the Yankees, but he's not. He's in jail because he lynched a black man. And he lynched a black man for being uppity to a lady. And he says he had it coming. He calls him the N-word. He says, I did lynch the N-word. He had it coming. He was uppity to a lady, and what else could a Southern gentleman do? So he is a homicidal white supremacist, I'm afraid. And Gone with the Wind is a story about homicidal white supremacists. It just is. It is defending homicidal white supremacism. It is defending lynching culture. They're the heroes. They're the good guys. This is a story that thinks Lincoln is the bad guy. Right? So we are in a moral universe where Lincoln is the enemy. The United States government is the enemy. One of the things I talk about in the book is the fact that we have to stop and think about the fact that this is a story that hates the United States government. Every character in this book hates the United States government. And Scarlett, so it's the most popular American book of the 20th century about Americans who hate the American government. And Scarlett, there's a bit after the war where Scarlett sees the United States flag flying in Atlanta, and it makes her burn with rage and resentment to see the American flag in Atlanta, because she doesn't feel American. She's a Confederate. That's what she is. The novel doesn't actually use the word American to describe anything except heritage. It never talks about it as a political identity, right? So it's just it talks about it in terms of nativism, about when your family came over, how American are you? But it doesn't talk about Americanness as a political identity. Anyway, that's an aside, but I think it's really important. And so this story, we have to stop and think about the fact that this is a story that sees Lincoln as the bad guy, that sees multiracial democracy as something that victimizes Scarlett and her circle. It's a story about the emergence of white grievance, this sense that the white people are the real victims here, and that any sign of black power or of of emancipation, or as they say, assertion of political identity for black Americans takes something away from white people. Now, in the White South, in the aftermath of the Civil War, it did, and that's part of what this is reflecting. It took away from them their hegemony. It took away from them their authoritarian control. What the Confederate South then created in the immediate aftermath of the war was what we would call in Germany a Herrenvolk democracy. It was a Herrenvolk democracy. in which only white people could vote. They suppressed, I'm sorry I missed the previous talk, but I understand that there was just a talk about the history of voter suppression in America, so I won't recapitulate that. But it comes out of this moment. It comes out of the aftermath of the Civil War. By the time we get to then the 20s and the 30s, as I say, the Klan has this kind of, what's the word I want to call it? An erratic history. It was suppressed in the 1870s. Then it got mythologized, and it turned into a kind of pop culture memory. And then it was reborn for various reasons in 1915, and then it gained power in the 1920s. By the mid-1920s, it was losing power. It was dogged by sex scandals and corruption, economic corruption. So financial corruption and sex scandals, plus ça change. And as the Klan lost power, what happened was that a lot of the individuals who were in the Second Klan then started up American fascist movements, and they called them fascist movements. They named them. They called them. There was the Atlanta Order of the Black Shirts. There was the Knights of the White Camellia. The Klan is the most famous. There were actually a lot of white supremacist groups in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. One of them was called the Knights of the White Camellia, and it was recreated in the 1930s by a man named George Dethridge. And I'll finish on George Dethridge in just a second. But so the point I want to make here is that, and this is the part I'm going to do with notes because I don't want to lose any of this detail. So if we reframe Gone with the Wind in the ways that I've been talking about, and remember that it's a story about homicidal white supremacists who don't want to relinquish their power, who are absolutely adamant that they will reclaim all of the power that they got from slavery, but insist that there's nothing wrong with slavery. It's also a story about white slavers that thinks that slavery doesn't matter, right? I mean, they are enslavers, that's the whole point, and it keeps insisting that slavery isn't important, which I also think is the story of American history. So what Gone with the Wind does, we could describe Gone with the Wind, I think fairly, as a story that defends counter-revolution on behalf of a Herrenvolk. Its entire ethos endorses a eugenicist version of survival of the fittest. That's Rhett, by the way. He's all into survival of the fittest, and it's very eugenicist, particularly in the book. And all of its protagonists believe that granting power to the racial underclass creates a Gotterdammerung for the master race. It's a story about white slaveholders trying desperately to reclaim their wealth and power that they gained from slavery and thinks that slavery doesn't matter. And it's a history of white grievance that thinks that they're the victims of the Civil War when they have merely lost the immoral and unjust war they started. People talk about Gone with the Wind as a love story between Scarlett and Rhett Butler. But it's really a love story between Scarlett and her plantation, Tara, which she is determined not to lose. In a just society, Scarlett would lose Tara. Her side of the war went to war so that they could keep those plantations and expand them. And when they lost the war, the white slaveholders were given all of their land back, and the only thing that they lost was human property. They got their land back, they got to a great extent, their money back. Of course, their economy was decimated, but to a great extent, they were able to recreate the foundations of their power and to rebuild that Herrenvolk democracy. And by the time we get to the 20s and 30s, then, we have the people who've inherited this tradition who were explicitly identifying as fascist and were building a fascist project, not just in the South, but across the United States, that was invoking this history, using the Confederate flag as part of the story that they were telling. And it is also, as I say, this is a difficult history to summarize. And I know I keep saying I'm finishing, so I will finish, but what I'm going to say is this. I'll give you one story, one anecdote to finish with, or example. There was an admiral in the Confederacy who was called Thomas Jefferson Page, and he was one of the Confederates who left the American South after the Civil War because they couldn't live in a multiracial democracy. They wouldn't do it. Black people were emancipated, and they were not going to be there. Rhett says at the end of the story that he might go back. He might actually go to Europe. He thinks as he's leaving Scarlett. Sorry for the Plot spoiler, but Rhett leaves Scarlet. That's why he says, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. And, but one of the places he thinks he might go to is Europe. And that's accurate. There were a great number of Confederates who felt that they would not live there. And so after the war, some of them went to Mexico and tried to create slave colonies in Mexico. Some of them went to Brazil and tried to create slave colonies in Brazil. And when that failed, they made their way to Europe. And Thomas Jefferson Page ended up in Rome. And his grandson grew up in a palazzo in Rome with Confederate flags and swords. And in 1933, he renounced his American citizenship, created a minor scandal in Virginia, because it was an old Virginia family, to become a fascist. And he ended up being Mussolini's propaganda minister. He was his Goebbels, basically, was an American who was the grandson of a Confederate. The steps from the American Confederacy to American fascism, are not long and not far apart. And so a lot of what I am doing in this book is trying to reframe Gone with the Wind against the history of American fascism in the 1930s to try to understand how that creates the continuities from the 1860s to today. So that's the project. Thank you very much for your patience and for listening, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for the very fascinating presentation. So before Gone with the Wind, there was Birth of a Nation.
Yeah.
And that is so reprehensible in some ways that it doesn't sustain the way that Gone with the Wind was. So I wonder if you think Gone with the Wind, still has this resonance and staying power because it's a more palatable story, and whether reading it or watching it. And there's a sort of romanticism to it. And then what that says, I guess I'm curious about how you understand cultural products, a film or something else, sort of transmuting into people's psychology and the impact that it has.
Yeah.
And why, I guess kind of juxtaposing Gone with the Wind from the way we think about Birth of a Nation, which is historical artifact, let's not show that to kids.
Yeah, definitely don't show it to kids. Thank you for that. I think it's a wonderful question, and I'll take the second part first, if I may, about the effect that it has on psychology. That's one of the main reasons that I wanted to put fiction and myth-making at the center of this reading of American history. It's why it's not just a straight account of history, but why it's going through the lens of Gone with the Wind. And my argument is, I think this is true, is that what fiction captures for us is exactly that psychology. And when you have something that is as phenomenally popular as Gone with the Wind was, you have a case to be made that it's capturing something about a collective psychology, and indeed shaping that collective psychology. What I think in particular, and kind of one of the theses of this book, to use an academic term for it, is that it's particularly about our defense mechanisms, American defense mechanisms, and denialism. It's really about denialism at the heart of it. It's just shot through with denialism and negation and willful blindness. I don't want to see it, and half-truths, and I don't want to remember this, and I don't want to know it. Because, of course, the reality is inconsistent with our utopian ideals, right? So we have this brutal reality and this utopian story we tell ourselves. And rather than reconcile those, we'd rather just pretend it's not happening, right? So I think that fiction for me, and I include film in fiction, right? I mean, storytelling, sorry, my wild hands are always hitting microphones. That kind of storytelling, it captures the emotions. It captures the emotions that drive it. It captures the desires in a way that reading documentary history doesn't always do. And that's why I wanted to put the two together, because I think that something as popular as Gone with the Wind does capture something important about a zeitgeist and a mindset. The point about Birth of a Nation and about how we view cultural artifacts. So yes, I think that Birth of a Nation is not an effective piece of filmmaking anymore. It is not something that people report feeling moved by or finding exciting. They just find it disgusting. It is, for those of you who don't know it, it is arguably the most racist movie ever made. But it's a silent film from 1915. It actually was one of the causes of the rebirth of the Klan because it romanticizes the Klan. and very much in the kind of same family as Gone with the Wind. And Margaret Mitchell grew up watching it and loved it, and she loved the novels that it was based on. And so that's very much at the heart of Gone with the Wind, as I'm sure you know. So I think that it's easier for us to distance ourselves from it because it doesn't manipulate us. It's not effective anymore. Gone with the Wind, for a lot of people, is still an effective piece of filmmaking. But implicit in your question is this question about what happens over time and what happens with the passage of time to a cultural artifact if it ceases to have that kind of impact. And what's interesting to me about Gone with the Wind is, as I've been doing this and talking to people about it, it's clear that Gone with the Wind is losing that effectiveness. I mean, I'm kind of seeing it in real time anecdotally as people say to me, I watched it and it was kind of laughable. And young people seeing it for the first time now are like, what on earth are you talking about? Scarlett's raising her fist and they're laughing, right? So they see it as cheesy and overwrought. And it's so racist that they don't get past that rightly. So, I think that when I was growing up watching it, we took an if we thought about the racism at all, which, we often didn't or wouldn't, I think the attitude would have been, it's racist, but. And now I think we're in a place where you can only say it's racist and go from there. Like, we can't put that to one side. So hopefully there's some progress being made in our cultural discourse in the ways that our changing attitudes around something like Gone with the Wind show that evolution of thinking and awareness about that. But it is still effective for a lot of people. And as I said, it is still incredibly popular. So, people often ask me a kind of corollary of that question is, do I think it should be canceled? Do I, sorry, me and my kind of like tying my hands behind my back. And I always say I'm a professor of literature. I'm not in the business of canceling books and films. I'm for them, even if I don't like some of what they have to say. But I think we have to engage with them. I think that's the point. And to me, if it drops out of history because it no longer has impact, well, that's the work of time. And every story has to fight for its place in our attention, right? But so we don't have to keep it alive. We don't have to do that work for it if it doesn't do that on its own. But as long as it's still there, I think we have an obligation to engage much more seriously with it. And the part of what I wanted to get at here is the superficiality of the takes that I was referring to at the beginning, of these kinds of quick references to the insurrection. And this is, the world of Gone with the Wind. And I was like, well, actually, if you look really closely at the world of Gone with the Wind, you'll see a lot more than you think is there. And that's kind of the starting premise, really. But thank you for that.